I'll give you 7 sons if you kill my husband. That's what the banker's wife promised the giant cowboy. In a town strangled by drought and ruled by fear, her words weren't a threat. They were a test. He hadn't drawn a gun in years, and she hadn't spoken truth in even longer. But what she carries behind quiet eyes could shatter everything the town believes about law, land, and loyalty. There's a paper no one's supposed to see, and a well everyone's willing to die for. When the dust rises and the church bell falls silent, who will the town follow? The man who won't kill, or the woman with nothing left to lose? Before we begin, drop a hello in the comments. Share your corner of the world and how you're feeling today. It's a beautiful thing to witness how stories can connect us across oceans, languages, and lives. The July sun beat down mercilessly on Sandridge Wells, baking the packed dirt streets until they cracked like old leather. Inside the weathered church, the townsfolk huddled together, their prayers for rain rising up through the rough-hewn rafters. The creak of wooden benches mixed with whispered amens as Reverend Cole's steady voice led them in worship. The Lord provides water for the thirsty. Reverend Cole spoke, his dark eyes scanning the congregation. Both for our bodies and our spirits. His words carried weight, especially now that Harlan Trumbull controlled every well in town save the one beneath the church's foundation. A sharp crack split the air. Mrs. Henderson's startled cry followed as the floorboard beneath her bench gave way. Quick as thought, Zeke Boone's large frame was there, helping the elderly woman to her feet. His weathered hands were gentle as he steadied her, then turned his attention to the broken bench. "Much obliged, Mr. Boone," Reverend Cole said softly, watching as Zeke's capable fingers worked to restore order. The tall cowboy just nodded, his movements careful and precise, as he helped reset the benches after the service ended. The congregation filtered out slowly, their boots stirring dust in the fading light. Reverend Cole paused at the door, his expression thoughtful as he watched Zeke work. "You've got healing hands, friend. More use for building than breaking." Zeke looked up, a ghost of a smile crossing his face. "Reckon that's why I gave up the cavalry life, Reverend." Evening settled over the church, like a purple shawl. Zeke finished his task in the growing darkness, the lamplight from the kitchen his only guide. He was just storing the last of the tools when a shadow fell across the pantry doorway. Eliza Trumbull stood there, her presence as unexpected as frost in summer. The lamp she carried cast golden light across her features, highlighting the careful way she held herself. Zeke had seen that kind of stillness before, in wounded creatures trying not to show their pain. "Mr. Boone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to speak with you." Zeke straightened slowly, conscious of the small space between them. "Mrs. Trumbull." She stepped into the pantry, closing the door part-way. The lamplight flickered across shelves lined with preserved goods and church supplies. "I have a proposition for you." Her words came out steady, but her fingers trembled slightly on the lamp handle. "Mom, I'll give you 7 sons," she said, the words falling into the hushed space between them like stones into still water. "If you kill my husband." The silence that followed felt thick enough to cut. Zeke stood perfectly still, his face unreadable in the shadowed light. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled. "That's not something to joke about, Mrs. Trumbull. Does this look like I'm joking?" She shifted the lamp, and for a moment, the light caught the edge of a bruise usually hidden by her high collar. Zeke's jaw tightened, but he shook his head. "I don't kill anymore, not for any reason." "Not even for justice?" Her voice carried an edge of desperation. "Not even to save others from—" She cut herself off, drawing in a sharp breath. "There are other ways to find justice, ma'am." His words were gentle, but firm. Eliza's shoulders sagged slightly, but something flickered in her eyes. Not defeat, but calculation. She reached into her pocket and withdrew an envelope, sealed with wax. "Then read this," she said, holding it out to him, "and decide what kind of man you want to be." Zeke hesitated before taking the envelope, tucking it into his vest pocket without breaking the seal. "The choice is yours, Mr. Boone," Eliza said, her composure returning like a mask sliding into place. "But choose carefully. More lives than mine hang in the balance." She turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. The lamplight caught the proud line of her spine, the careful way she held her head high despite everything. 7 sons, she repeated softly. A new family built on truth instead of lies. Think on that. Then she was gone, her footsteps fading down the church hallway, leaving Zeke alone in the pantry with an envelope that felt as heavy as a gravestone in his pocket. The lamp sputtered once, throwing shadows against the wall that seemed to dance like restless spirits, waiting for his decision. Dawn broke over Sandridge Wells in streaks of dusty gold. Zeke Boone sat alone on the rocky hillside above town, his broad shoulders hunched against the morning chill as he studied the papers from Eliza's envelope for the 3rd time. The Territorial Water Rights Treaty, dated 1858, was written in careful script that had faded to brown. His calloused finger traced the official seals and signatures, following the careful documentation of water sources marked as protected tribal land. The crude map accompanying the treaty showed familiar landmarks: the church, the winding creek, and the surrounding parcels that Harlan Trumbull now claimed as his own. But according to these papers, the church, well, and creek had never been Trumbull's to take. They were protected land, designated for the original inhabitants, long before the banker had arrived with his stack of deeds. The morning sun climbed higher as Zeke committed every detail to memory. Wind rustled the prairie grass around him, carrying the scent of dust and sage. Below, the town stirred to life, unaware of the truth he held in his hands. When afternoon shadows began to stretch across the valley, Zeke made his way to the church. He found Reverend Cole in his small study, bent over a worn Bible. The preacher looked up as Zeke entered, his dark eyes sharp with understanding. "Something troubles you, friend?" Reverend Cole asked, marking his place with a leather cord. Zeke placed the treaty carefully on the desk. "Need your eyes on this, Reverend. Your knowledge of the old agreements." Reverend Cole's expression grew serious as he examined the document. He handled the aged paper with reverence, reading each line with careful attention. After several minutes, he looked up. "This is genuine. The seals, the signatures, I recognize them from my time as an agency clerk. Where did you get this?" "Mrs. Trumbull," Zeke said quietly. "Found it somewhere in that bank, I reckon." The preacher's face darkened. "Then she's in danger. Harlan Trumbull has been forging deeds for years, pushing families off land that was never his. If he discovers she has proof..." He trailed off, his meaning clear. "He's already hurting her," Zeke said, his voice rough with contained anger. Reverend Cole nodded slowly. "I've seen the bruises she tries to hide, but this..." He tapped the treaty. "This could destroy everything Trumbull's built. His empire rests on false papers and borrowed water." The afternoon light was fading to purple dusk when Zeke approached the Trumbull house. He found Eliza in the back garden, kneeling beside a climbing rose bush. Her wide-brimmed hat was pulled low, but not low enough to hide the fresh bruise blooming across her cheekbone. She stiffened at his footsteps, then relaxed slightly when she recognized him. "Mr. Boone." "Mom." He kept his distance, not wanting to frighten her. "Read your letter. Spoke with Reverend Cole." Eliza's hands stilled on the rose stems. "And, treaty's real enough, but there's something you ain't told me about your situation here." She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers working methodically to tie back a wayward rose branch. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was 18 when I came to Sandridge Wells. No family, no prospects, just education enough to teach school." She secured the branch with a piece of twine. "Harlan offered marriage, security, but I'd seen how he treated his first wife before she died, so I..." She drew a steadying breath. "I forged the marriage documents, changed some dates, some names. He never knew. He was too proud to check carefully." Zeke absorbed this in silence. The evening breeze carried the sweet scent of roses, mixing with the dust of the day. "I'm not his legal wife," Eliza continued, her voice stronger now. Never have been. But that paper gave me safety, a roof, enough stability to help others when I could. She finally looked up at him, her eyes clear and determined. I didn't ask you to kill him because I want revenge, Mr. Boone. I asked because I thought it was the only way to stop him. But now we have the treaty. Zeke finished. She nodded. Justice doesn't have to come from the barrel of a gun. Sometimes it comes from ink and paper, and the courage to use them right. She touched her bruised cheek absently. I've lived with lies long enough. It's time for truth to have its day. The garden grew darker around them as the last light faded from the sky. In the distance, a coyote called out lonely and long. Zeke studied the woman before him. Not a murderer or a schemer, but a survivor who had done what she needed to live. Now she was choosing a different path, one that might cost her everything but would save others from Trumble's greed. The moon cast long shadows through the church windows as Zeke, Eliza, and Reverend Cole gathered in the empty sanctuary. A single oil lamp flickered on the altar, their voices barely rising above whispers. Outside, a warm night wind rattled the loose shingles, masking their conversation from any who might pass by. The territorial marshal makes his rounds every month, Reverend Cole said, spreading the treaty papers on a wooden pew. He's due in Sandridge Wells in 2 weeks' time. Eliza nodded, her fingers tracing the document's edge. If we can prove these water rights belong to the tribal families, it invalidates every deed Harlan's issued since '58. We need more than paper, Zeke said quietly. Need living voices to back it. Bluebird, Reverend Cole suggested. She keeps the old stories, knows every spring and creek bed from here to the mountains. He turned to Eliza. Her family's been here since before the treaty was signed. As if summoned by her name, a shadow moved near the church door. Bluebird stepped into the lamplight, her dark eyes taking in the scene. She moved with the silent grace of one used to walking between two worlds. I heard my name spoken, she said simply, settling onto a nearby bench. And I see truth being discussed in the night hours. Reverend Cole explained their discovery of the treaty and their plan to present it to the marshal. Bluebird listened without interruption, her weathered hands folded in her lap. When he finished, she reached for the treaty, studying it with careful attention. These boundaries, she said, they match the stories my grandmother told. Each spring, each sacred water place. She looked up at them. But Trumbull moves faster than your law. Eliza leaned forward. What do you mean? 3 days ago, papers came from Fort Apache. Federal orders. Bluebird's voice held carefully controlled anger. Trumbull has filed claims, says we are squatters on his land. They will remove our families within days. The news fell heavy in the quiet church. Zeke's hands clenched at his sides, remembering the faces of children he'd seen displaced before during his cavalry days. How many families? He asked. 12, Bluebird answered, including the old ones who cannot travel far. Reverend Cole rubbed his face, the lamp casting deep shadows in his troubled expression. 2 weeks before the marshal arrives, that's too long. Then we find more proof, Eliza said firmly. Something Trumbull can't ignore or destroy. Bluebird was quiet for a moment, considering. Then she spoke, her words measured and clear. My uncle, before he walked on to the spirit world, he told me something. When this church was built, he helped lay the cornerstone. He said he put something there, a copy of the original treaty, sealed in wax and leather. Zeke straightened. A second copy? Yes. He didn't trust the white man's paper buildings to keep our rights safe, so he made sure there was proof that couldn't be burned or lost. Bluebird's eyes met Zeke's. The cornerstone faces east, where the sun rises. If it's still there, it would be untouched. I'll check it at first light, Zeke said, before folks start moving about town. They spent another hour planning, speaking in low voices about legal documents and water rights, about justice and timing. Finally, they separated, leaving one by one to avoid notice. Bluebird disappeared into the darkness like a shadow. Reverend Cole retired to his small room behind the church. Zeke waited until Eliza was safely back to the banker's house before heading to his own cabin. Across town, in his study, Harlan Trumbull sat in his leather chair, a glass of whiskey untouched beside him. His silver-handled Colt revolver lay across his desk, catching the lamplight. His eyes moved between the weapon and the empty bed, visible through his study door. Eliza's bed, where she should be sleeping. He'd watched her slip out earlier, had seen her shadow move through the garden toward the church. His fingers drummed slowly on the desk, a steady rhythm like falling water. Something was changing in his carefully ordered world. He could feel it, like the pressure before a storm. Trumbull lifted the pistol, checking its chambers with practiced ease. 6 bullets, 6 chances to maintain order. He'd built this town from dust and paper, had bent the law until it served his purposes. He wouldn't let anyone, not his wife, not some ranch hand, not even the original inhabitants, take what he'd claimed as his. The night grew deeper, and still he sat, watching the empty bed, waiting for Eliza to return. The pistol gleamed in the lamplight, a silent promise of power and control. Outside, a coyote's cry echoed through the streets of Sandridge Wells, wild and untamed, like the truth that was slowly working its way to the surface. The first pale light of dawn crept over Sandridge Wells as Zeke and Reverend Cole met at the church's eastern corner. Dew still clung to the sparse grass, and their boots left dark prints as they moved quietly through the yard. Zeke carried 2 iron crowbars, worn smooth from years of ranch work. "Here," Reverend Cole whispered, running his hand along the cornerstone's weathered face. "This is the one Bluebird spoke of." The stone was massive, nearly 3 feet across, set deep into the church's foundation. Years of sun and rain had darkened its surface, but the original chisel marks were still visible around the edges. "Got to be careful," Zeke said, positioning his crowbar. "Don't want to damage what might be inside." They worked slowly, methodically, using the crowbars as levers to create small gaps around the stone's edges. Sweat beaded on their foreheads as the sun climbed higher. The iron tools creaked against the rock, each small victory marked by crumbling mortar and widening cracks. After 2 hours of steady work, Reverend Cole paused, wiping his brow. "Listen." The crowbar had struck something hollow, a different sound than stone against stone. They redoubled their efforts, focusing on that spot until a small cavity appeared behind the cornerstone. Zeke reached in carefully, his large hands gentle as he felt around the space. His fingers touched something wrapped in cloth. "Got it?" he murmured, slowly withdrawing a package about the size of a Bible. The oilcloth wrapping was still intact, sealed with wax and twine. Inside, they found a tin box, tarnished but unrusted. Reverend Cole's hands trembled slightly as he opened it, revealing a yellow document carefully folded inside. "It's here," he breathed, unfolding the treaty with reverence. "Look, the federal agent's seal and signature. Agent James Morton. He passed on 3 winters ago, but this is his mark, clear as day." Zeke studied the document, noting the careful descriptions of water rights and land boundaries. "This proves everything Eliza said. Shows the church well and creek belong to the tribal families. We need to hide it somewhere safe," Reverend Cole said, carefully refolding the treaty. "Somewhere Trumbull won't think to look." They moved inside the church, where Zeke climbed into the rafters using a ladder from the tool shed. High above the altar, he found a secure spot between 2 heavy beams where the treaty would stay dry and undisturbed. Just as they finished concealing their morning's work, the church door creaked open. Both men turned sharply, but it was only Eliza, carrying a covered basket. "Brought you some biscuits," she said softly. "Figured you'd be hungry after—" She froze as boots scuffed on the church steps outside. Through the window they saw Trumbull's stable hand walking past, leading a horse to water. They held their breath until his whistling faded away. "That was too close," Zeke said, accepting a still warm biscuit from Eliza's basket. Before they could relax, Bluebird appeared at the side door, her usual calm demeanor edged with urgency. "The army moves faster than we feared," she said without preamble. "Orders came this morning. They begin removing families tomorrow at first light." Reverend Cole's face darkened. "Tomorrow? That's too soon." "Then we split up," Eliza said decisively. "Cover more ground before Trumbull realizes what we're doing." She laid out her plan quickly. "I'll gather statements from townspeople who've lost their water rights. Many will speak now, knowing there's proof." Reverend Cole nodded. "I'll draft a public statement, something that can't be ignored when the marshal arrives. Include the treaty terms and witness accounts. Bluebird and I can ride to the telegraph office in Shadow Creek." Zeke added, "Send copies of the treaty details to the marshal. Might reach him before he starts his rounds." "Be careful on that ride," Eliza warned. "It's Trumbull's regular route for bank business. His men watch it close." Bluebird's dark eyes held a glimmer of determination. "We know other paths," she said, "ways that don't follow his roads." They finished their biscuits quickly, aware that every minute brought them closer to tomorrow's threat. As they prepared to separate, Zeke caught Eliza's arm gently. "Stay safe," he said quietly. "Trumbull's bound to notice something's different." She touched his hand briefly, her voice steady. "We all do what must be done. Justice doesn't come easy, but it comes sure." They left the church separately, each carrying their part of the plan. The morning sun climbed higher over Sandridge Wells, promising another scorching day. But for the first time in years, something else was rising in the dry frontier town. Hope, as steady and unstoppable as an underground spring finding its way to light. The evening sun painted long shadows across the prairie as Zeke and Bluebird guided their horses away from Sandridge Wells. They kept to the lesser-used trails, avoiding the main road to Dry Hollow Junction where Trumbull's men might be watching. "Best we take it slow," Zeke said quietly, his eyes scanning the darkening landscape. "No sense drawing attention with dust or hoofbeats?" Bluebird nodded, her dark hair catching the last rays of sunlight. She rode with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle, her horse responding to the slightest touch. They followed old game trails and dry creek beds, places where their passing would leave little trace. The moon rose full and bright, turning the prairie grass silver. Crickets chirped their evening songs, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. The steady rhythm of their horses' hooves marked time as the miles slowly passed. It was well past midnight when they finally spotted the dim lights of Dry Hollow Junction. The telegraph office sat dark and quiet, but a thin line of lamplight showed beneath the door. Zeke dismounted first, helping Bluebird down before tying their horses to the hitching post. The night clerk looked up startled when they entered, his spectacles reflecting the lamp's glow. "We're closed for regular business," he started to say, but Zeke produced Reverend Cole's sealed letter. "This needs sending tonight," Zeke said firmly. "It carries the preacher's signet. Matter of territorial law." The clerk examined the seal carefully, then nodded. "Reverend Cole's mark? Sure enough. Give me a few minutes to send it through." They waited as the telegraph key clicked and clattered, sending their message across the wire. The clerk worked steadily, transcribing the treaty details with careful precision. When he finished, he handed them a receipt marked with the time and date. "Storm's coming," he warned as they prepared to leave. "Might want to wait it out." They had barely ridden 2 miles when the clerk's warning proved true. Lightning split the sky, followed by booming thunder that made their horses dance nervously. Fat raindrops began to fall, quickly turning into a downpour. "There," Bluebird pointed to a shape looming in the darkness. "Old wagon shed." They urged their horses toward the shelter, dismounting quickly as the storm intensified. The shed was sturdy enough, its roof keeping out most of the rain. They settled their horses, then found seats on some empty crates near the back wall. Lightning flashed again, illuminating Bluebird's face as she spoke. My grandmother saw them do it, she said softly. Trumbull's men. They came in the night with bottles of poison for our wells. Zeke listened quietly as she continued. She told the agent then, but he did nothing. Said there was no proof. But she remembered. We all remembered. Thunder rolled overhead, and Zeke's voice was barely audible above it. Reminds me of the war, he said. Not the fighting so much as the waiting. Knowing something bad was coming, but not being able to stop it. You lost family there, Bluebird said. It wasn't a question. 6 brothers, Zeke confirmed, his words heavy with old grief. Buried them one by one. Last one died at Gettysburg. After that, I swore I'd never raise a gun again. Figured the world had seen enough killing. Bluebird was quiet for a long moment. Sometimes the strongest warrior is the one who chooses not to fight, she said finally. My people understand this. They fell silent, listening to the storm rage outside. Eventually the thunder grew distant, and the rain settled into a gentle patter on the roof. They dozed fitfully, taking turns keeping watch until the first grey light of dawn began to seep into the sky. The morning air was fresh and clean as they mounted up for the ride back to town. Their clothes were still damp, and exhaustion weighed heavily on both of them, but there was a sense of accomplishment in having completed their mission. Meanwhile, in Sandridge Wells, Harlan Trumbull sat in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched before him. His stable hand, Jim Tucker, shifted nervously by the door. You're certain about this? Trumbull asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Yes, sir. Tucker nodded. Saw them ride out just after sunset, headed toward Dry Hollow Junction. Telegraph office, there's the only one for 20 miles. Trumbull's fingers drummed slowly on his desk. And the woman with him, it was the Apache midwife. Yes, sir. Bluebird, they call her. Rode out together, all secret-like. Trumbull reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a stack of bills. He counted out several and handed them to Tucker. You've done well. Now get out. After the stable hand left, Trumbull stood and walked to his window. The town was just beginning to stir in the early morning light. His lips curved into a cold smile as he began to plan his next move. The telegraph might have been sent, but he still held cards they didn't know about, and he intended to play them all. Dust motes danced in the late afternoon sunlight as Zeke pushed open his cabin door. Something felt wrong before he even stepped inside. The air held a different smell. Tobacco smoke that wasn't his. Boot leather he didn't own. His small home had been turned inside out. The mattress lay slashed and crooked, straw spilling onto the plank floor. His few books were scattered, their pages bent. Cupboard doors hung open, dishes knocked askew. Even the floorboards had been pried up in places, leaving ugly gaps in the worn wood. Zeke moved through the chaos with careful steps, taking inventory. His mother's old Bible still sat untouched on the shelf. The tin of coffee beans remained in its place. His spare clothes lay in a twisted heap, but nothing seemed missing except the envelope. His heart sank as he checked the hollow space behind the loose brick in the hearth. The original envelope Eliza had given him was gone. Outside, fresh boot prints marked the dusty ground around his cabin. At least 3 different sets, he noted, studying the patterns. They led back toward town. Trumbull's men had followed him home, waited until he'd left for Dry Hollow Junction, then torn apart his sanctuary looking for proof. Without wasting time, Zeke saddled his horse again and rode to Bluebird's home on the outskirts of town. The sun was setting by the time he reached the small adobe dwelling, casting long shadows across her herb garden. Bluebird opened her door before he could knock, reading the urgency in his stance. They came, she said simply. It wasn't a question. Took the envelope. Zeke confirmed, his voice low. Your family needs to hide, tonight. She nodded, already moving to gather essential items. My sister's people have a camp in the high country. We will go there until this ends. I'll help you pack, Zeke offered, but she shook her head. Number U must warn Cole. The treaty must be moved. Her dark eyes met his. "We know how to disappear when we must." Zeke found Reverend Cole at the church, carefully cleaning the mud from the cornerstone they'd disturbed earlier. The preacher listened gravely to Zeke's news, then led the way inside. "The rafters aren't safe anymore," Cole said, reaching up to retrieve the tin box. "We'll move it to the schoolhouse attic. Nobody thinks to look there, and the children's noise will cover any creaking boards." They waited until full dark before making the transfer, Cole carrying the precious document under his coat while Zeke watched for observers. The schoolhouse stood silent and empty, its windows dark. They slipped inside using Cole's spare key, climbing carefully to the attic space above the classroom. "Here," Cole whispered, tucking the tin box behind a stack of old primers. "Now we pray it stays safe until the marshal arrives." Dawn brought new trouble. Zeke woke to the sound of hammering from the direction of the church. He dressed quickly and walked into town, his boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. A crowd had gathered around the church well. Trumbull stood watching as his men erected a sturdy fence around the water source, complete with a heavy padlock on the gate. 2 armed guards lounged nearby, rifles clearly visible. "By order of the Sandridge Wells Bank," Trumbull announced to the assembled townsfolk, his voice carrying across the morning air, "this well is now under bank lien due to delinquent property taxes. Access will be strictly controlled." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A few people shifted angrily, but no one spoke up. They'd seen what happened to those who crossed Harlan Trumbull. One by one, they drifted away, leaving the well behind its new prison of wooden slats and iron chains. Later that afternoon, as Zeke checked his horse's tack outside the livery stable, he found a folded note tucked into his saddlebag. He recognized Eliza's neat handwriting immediately. "He'll strike soon. Please be ready." The message sent a chill down his spine, despite the warm evening air. As darkness fell, Zeke positioned himself in the shadows of the alley across from the Trumbull house. The banker's residence stood proud and well lit, its windows glowing like angry eyes in the night. From his vantage point, Zeke could see Eliza's silhouette move past the upstairs windows several times. Once, he caught a glimpse of Trumbull's shape as well, pacing in his study like a caged mountain lion. The hours crept by. Somewhere in town, a dog barked at nothing. The saloon's piano played distant, tinny notes that floated on the night air. One by one, lights winked out in surrounding houses as honest folk went to bed. Still, Zeke kept his vigil, watching and waiting. Eliza's warning echoed in his mind. Whatever Trumbull planned, it would come soon, and Zeke intended to be ready when it did. The first rays of dawn had barely touched the horizon when shouts pierced the morning quiet. Zeke jolted awake in his chair by the window, where he'd dozed off during his vigil. The sounds grew clearer. Women crying, children screaming, men barking orders. He rushed outside, boots pounding against the packed earth. The commotion came from the cluster of homes where Bluebird's family lived. His heart sank at the sight before him. Army officers in dusty blue uniforms were forcing families from their homes, herding them into a waiting wagon train. "By order of the United States Army," an officer waved a document overhead. "These persons are to be relocated to designated territorial lands." Bluebird stood rigid as stone, her face a mask of dignity even as soldiers pushed her family towards the wagons. Her young son, Joseph, clung to her skirts until a soldier roughly pulled him away. People began pouring out of their homes, drawn by the chaos. Reverend Cole arrived at a run, his collar askew. "This isn't right," he called out. "These families have protected status." The commanding officer turned, mustache bristling. "We have federal orders, Reverend, signed and sealed. Anyone interfering will be arrested for obstruction." More townspeople gathered, their angry mutters growing louder. Some stepped forward, only to freeze when soldiers raised their rifles. Through the crowd came Harlan Trumbull, immaculate in his black suit despite the early hour, a satisfied smile playing at his lips. "It's all perfectly legal," Trumbull announced. "The land has been properly claimed. The army is simply enforcing federal law." A heart-wrenching sob cut through the tension. Eliza stood at the edge of the crowd, her composure finally breaking. "No," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "This wasn't what I wanted. This isn't right." Her voice cracked with anguish. Zeke moved to her side, letting her grab his arm for support as she watched Joseph being lifted into a wagon. The boy's frightened eyes met theirs before the canvas flap fell closed. "We have to do something," Eliza whispered fiercely through her tears. Reverend Cole was already moving, his voice carrying quiet authority. "Meet me behind the church in 15 minutes. Bring only what you need." When they gathered at the appointed spot, Cole had his wagon ready, provisions hastily loaded. "We can intercept them at Cross Creek Station before they reach the depot," he said, checking the harness. "It's our only chance to stop this." "I'm going with you," Zeke stated firmly, already climbing aboard. Eliza stepped forward, her earlier tears replaced by steel determination. "Me too. Those officers need to hear the truth, from me." She met Cole's questioning look. "I know what's in those forged orders. I can prove they're false." A light drizzle began to fall as they made final preparations, the drops pattering softly on the wagon's canvas cover. Martha, the blacksmith's wife, hurried over with a bundle of food. "Hold the church," Cole told her quietly. "We'll return with the truth." Martha nodded, clutching her shawl against the rain. "God go with you," she whispered. They set out as the town clock struck noon, the wagon wheels cutting fresh tracks in the muddy street. Zeke took the reins while Cole studied his maps. Eliza sat silent, her face set with purpose. Behind them, Sandridge Wells grew quiet, as if holding its breath. The drizzle continued steady and soft, like tears from heaven itself. Zeke felt the weight of their mission pressing down harder than the damp air. Somewhere ahead, Bluebird and her people were being carried away from their homes, their lives disrupted by one man's greed. He glanced at Eliza, seeing the same resolve in her eyes that he felt in his heart. They had proof of the truth. Now they just had to make it count. The wagon rolled on through the rain, carrying hope and justice toward Cross Creek Station. "We'll make this right," Zeke said softly, though whether to himself or his companions, he wasn't sure. The only response was the steady drumming of rain on canvas and the creak of wooden wheels, turning ever eastward on their vital mission. The wagon rolled steadily eastward through the hills, wheels creaking over the rutted trail. Dust rose in their wake, painting the afternoon sky a hazy gold. Reverend Cole sat hunched over his maps while Eliza dozed against a pile of blankets. Zeke handled the reins with care, guiding the horses around the worst of the bumps. As evening approached, they made camp beside a dry creek bed where scattered cottonwoods offered some shelter. The branches creaked softly in the cooling breeze, while Reverend Cole tended to a small fire. Eliza helped arrange their bedrolls, her movements careful and precise. "Best get some rest," Reverend Cole said, stirring the pot of beans warming over the flames. "We've got hard riding ahead tomorrow." After their simple supper, Eliza settled near the fire, wrapped in her shawl. Sleep came quickly to her, the exhaustion of recent days evident in the dark circles beneath her eyes. Reverend Cole soon followed, leaving Zeke to take first watch. The night settled around them like a heavy blanket. Zeke sat with his back against a twisted cottonwood, watching the stars wheel overhead. The familiar weight of his father's pocket watch ticked steadily in his vest. No sound disturbed the peace except the occasional pop of burning wood and the soft breathing of his companions. Morning found them breaking camp early, the eastern sky barely touched with light. They reached Red Fork Relay Station just as the sun cleared the horizon. The station was a simple affair, a long, low building of sun-bleached boards with a stable attached. A weathered sign creaked on its chains above the door. Reverend Cole straightened his collar before approaching the building. "The station master here is my cousin," he explained. "If anyone knows the army's movements, it'll be him." Inside, they found a lean man with Cole's same dark eyes sorting mail behind a rough wooden counter. His face brightened at the sight of the preacher. "Jeremiah, what brings you out this way?" The two men spoke in low voices, while Zeke and Eliza waited by the pot-bellied stove. After several minutes, Reverend Cole rejoined them, his expression grave but hopeful. "The army train will stop at Crooked Bluff siding tomorrow morning," he said quietly. "They need to water the horses and change crews. That's our chance." They made camp that night in a sheltered hollow, the wagon positioned to block the wind. Reverend Cole had taken first watch this time, leaving Zeke and Eliza sitting together by the dying fire. The flames cast flickering shadows across their faces as they talked in hushed tones. "I always wanted children," Eliza said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. She stared into the embers, hands clasped tight in her lap. But Harlan, he never saw the point. To him, children were just mouths to feed, not hearts to love. Her words carried years of buried pain. Zeke was quiet for a long moment, watching the sparks drift upward into the dark sky. "Before the war," he said finally, "I had dreams of having a family of my own. A house full of little ones running around, causing trouble." He smiled faintly at the memory. "But after burying my brothers, something in me went hard. Figured maybe it was better not to bring new life into such a harsh world." Eliza turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "And now?" "Now?" Zeke considered the question carefully. "Now I'm starting to remember that life ain't just about surviving. It's about building something worth living for." They sat in companionable silence as the fire burned lower. The eastern sky began to lighten, painting the sage-covered hills in shades of pink and gold. Eliza reached over and touched Zeke's hand briefly, a gesture of understanding that needed no words. Dawn crept across the land, bringing with it birdsong and the promise of a new day. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of sage and morning dew. In that quiet moment, something shifted between them. An acknowledgement of shared pain, shared dreams, and perhaps shared hope. Reverend Cole stirred from his post, beginning to prepare coffee over the rekindled fire. The gentle domestic sounds broke the spell of the moment, but the understanding remained. They had both carried their hurts alone for so long. Now, in this unexpected journey, they were finding that some burdens became lighter when shared. As they began breaking camp, Zeke caught Eliza's eye across the morning fire. The sunrise painted her face in soft light, and for the first time since he'd known her, he saw something new there. Not just determination or courage, but a gentle warmth that spoke of possibilities yet to come. The morning sun climbed higher as their wagon approached Crooked Bluff siding. Steam billowed from the waiting train, its iron bulk stark against the desert landscape. The rails gleamed like silver threads stretching toward the horizon. Zeke pulled the horses to a stop behind a stand of scrub oak. Through the branches they could see soldiers milling around the train cars. Apache families huddled in groups on the platform, their faces drawn with worry and exhaustion. "Trumbull," Eliza whispered, gripping Zeke's arm. Sure enough, the banker stood on the rear platform of the passenger car, directing soldiers with sharp gestures. His usual neat appearance was rumpled, his collar wilted in the growing heat. Reverend Cole straightened his worn black coat. "Let me approach first," he said quietly. "The commanding officer might recognize me from my translation work." He pulled the wrapped treaty from his saddlebag, handling it with careful reverence. They walked toward the train, dust swirling around their boots. Soldiers turned to watch their approach, hands resting near their weapons. A tall officer with captain's bars stepped forward to meet them. "Reverend Cole?" the captain said, nodding curtly. "This is a military operation. I'll have to ask you to leave." "Captain Rogers?" Cole replied, his voice steady. "I have documents you need to see." He held out the wrapped treaty. Trumbull's voice cut through the morning air. "More fabrications from these troublemakers." He strode down the platform steps, his face flushed. "I warned you they might try something like this, Captain." The officer hesitated, glancing between Cole and Trumbull. Behind him, the Apache families watched in tense silence. Bluebird's son, a boy of perhaps 8 years, pressed against his mother's skirts. This treaty bears the federal seal. Cole continued, carefully unfolding the yellowed paper. It establishes tribal protection for these lands, including water rights. These removals are illegal. Trumbull laughed sharply. A clever forgery, nothing more. I have proper documentation filed with the territorial office. He turned to the captain. We're wasting daylight. The officer stepped closer to examine the treaty. This appears to be. A sudden commotion erupted near the passenger car. Bluebird's son had broken free from a soldier's grip, darting between legs and boxes. The boy ran straight for Eliza, who dropped to her knees and caught him in her arms. It's all right, she murmured, holding him close as soldiers moved forward. No one's going to hurt you. The captain raised his hand, stopping his men. Something in the scene, the boy's trust, Eliza's protective embrace, made him pause. Let me see that seal again, Reverend. Zeke stepped forward, carefully opening the oiled cloth. The federal stamp stood out clearly on the aged paper, its intricate design unmistakable. Beside it, the signature and mark of the original agent remained sharp and legible. The captain pulled a small notebook from his pocket, comparing the seal and signatures. His expression grew grave. This matches our records exactly. He looked up at Trumbull, who had gone pale. Mr. Trumbull, I believe you have some explaining to do. This is absurd, Trumbull sputtered. I have authority. Your authority, the captain cut in, appears to be based on fraudulent documents. He turned to his lieutenant. Escort these families from the train, carefully. To another soldier, he added, keep Mr. Trumbull under guard until we sort this out. Two soldiers took Trumbull's arms as he tried to back away. You can't do this! I have rights! Rights? Eliza stood, still holding the boy. Like the rights you stole from others? Bluebird hurried forward through the dispersing crowd. Her son squirmed free from Eliza and ran to his mother's waiting arms. They held each other tightly as other families began climbing down from the train cars, gathering their scattered belongings. Zeke watched as soldiers helped elderly tribal members navigate the steep steps. Children reunited with parents, their relieved voices filling the morning air. The captain spoke quietly with Reverend Cole, making notes in his book. Trumbull stood between his guards, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. His eyes met Eliza's across the platform. She held his gaze steadily, no longer afraid. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the cool air. Steam continued to drift from the waiting engine, but its purpose had changed. Instead of carrying families away from their homes, it would return empty, except for one passenger under guard. Bluebird approached them, her son's hand clasped firmly in hers. Tears shone in her eyes as she looked at each of them in turn. No words were needed. Her gratitude was clear in every line of her face. The wagon rolled into Sandridge Wells as afternoon shadows stretched across the dusty main street. Zeke guided the tired horses past the bank, its windows dark and shuttered. Reverend Cole sat beside him, the precious treaty secure in his coat pocket. In the back, Eliza dozed fitfully, exhausted from their journey. The clip-clop of hooves drew townsfolk from their homes and shops. Word of their approach had spread quickly, and people gathered along the street, their faces expectant. As they neared the church, Zeke saw the well standing unguarded, its iron gate hanging open. Look, Reverend Cole said softly, nodding toward the church steps. At least 50 people had assembled there, including children perched on their parents' shoulders. The blacksmith's wife stood at the front, hands clasped as if in prayer. Zeke pulled the wagon to a stop near the old hitching post. Its weathered wood bore the marks of countless rains and memories. He helped Eliza down, steadying her as her feet touched the ground. She squeezed his hand briefly before turning to face the crowd. For a moment, silence hung in the air like summer heat. Then Eliza walked to the hitching post and climbed atop it, her skirts rustling in the breeze. She stood straight-backed, chin lifted, as if drawing strength from the very ground beneath her feet. "Good people of Sandridge Wells," she began, her voice clear and steady. "I've carried a truth that needs telling." She paused, looking out over the familiar faces. I was never his wife. The marriage was a fiction I created years ago to survive. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but she continued. But I am your neighbor, and I've seen enough hurt. We all have. The blacksmith's wife stepped forward. We knew something wasn't right, Miss Eliza. The way he treated you. Treated all of us. Reverend Cole moved towards the church doors, treaty in hand. This document proves what many suspected, he announced, carefully unfolding the yellowed paper. The water rights here belong to all of us, settler and tribal families alike. He posted the treaty on the heavy wooden doors, securing it with 4 brass tacks that gleamed in the late afternoon light. People moved closer to examine the document, pointing at the federal seal and discussing in hushed tones. Children wriggled through the crowd for a better look, their eyes wide with curiosity. Zeke noticed them watching and walked over, crouching down to their level. You want to know what all this means? He asked softly. The children nodded, gathering around him. Sometimes the best justice is the kind that doesn't leave blood in the dust. It's about making things right, not getting even. A small girl with braided hair tugged at his sleeve. But what about Mr. Trumbull? Is he going to jail? He'll answer for what he did, Zeke replied carefully. But more important is what we do now, how we rebuild together. As if on cue, Bluebird appeared at the edge of the crowd, her presence drawing attention. She walked forward with quiet dignity, stopping beside Eliza, who had stepped down from the hitching post. My people will return, Bluebird announced, her voice carrying across the churchyard. We will rebuild our homes near the creek, as our grandmothers did. The wells will serve all who thirst. She looked at the gathered faces. This is how healing begins. The townsfolk began to nod slowly. First one, then another, like wheat swaying in a gentle wind. The schoolteacher raised her hand. My classroom is open to all children who wish to learn. I can help with the building, the carpenter called out. More voices joined in, offering assistance, sharing ideas. The fear that had gripped the town began to loosen its hold, replaced by something new. Hope, tentative but growing. Eliza watched it unfold, tears gathering in her eyes. Zeke moved to stand beside her, his solid presence offering quiet support. Reverend Cole joined them, treaty now secure on the church doors behind him. Well, the preacher said softly. Looks like we might need more benches in church come Sunday. A small smile tugged at Eliza's lips. And more desks in the schoolroom. More work for everyone, Zeke added, watching the townspeople continue to gather in small groups, making plans. The late afternoon sun painted the church well's water bucket in shades of gold. A young boy ran up to it, lowered the bucket, and drew fresh water. He offered the dipper first to Bluebird, then to others standing nearby. They drank together, passing the dipper from hand to hand, neighbor to neighbor. The simple act spoke louder than any declaration. Sandridge Wells was changing, one small kindness at a time. The healing had begun. The summer days settled into a gentler rhythm as Sandridge Wells found its new balance. Morning light would find Eliza at the schoolhouse door early, arranging wooden slates and chalk for her growing class of students. Young mothers arrived with babes bundled against their chests, sitting beside children of mixed heritage who had never before shared desk space. Letters are like seeds, Eliza would say, drawing careful shapes on the blackboard. Plant them right, and they grow into words that feed the mind. Her students traced letters in the dust of their slates, determination etched on faces both young and old. Sarah Whitecrow, barely 16 with an infant son, struggled with her reading, but showed up faithfully each morning. My boy will know his letters proper, she'd declare, bouncing the baby while sounding out simple words. Eliza would often catch her practicing by lamplight through the schoolhouse window long after class had ended. Down the street, Bluebird transformed an empty storeroom beside the mercantile into a small herbal shop. She lined rough wooden shelves with clay jars of dried sage, yarrow, and wild mint gathered from the hills. Townsfolk who once avoided her now stopped to ask about remedies for summer colds or teething babies. "Medicine is like water," Bluebird would explain, measuring herbs into small paper packets. "It flows where it's needed, asks no questions about the hands that hold it." Even Mrs. Peterson, who had once crossed the street to avoid tribal members, now brought her feverish grandson for Bluebird's willow bark tea. Zeke spent his mornings mending the church fence, replacing rotted posts and straightening the wire that had sagged over years of neglect. The steady rhythm of his hammer drew curious children who perched on nearby rocks to watch him work. "Fence ain't to keep folks out," he'd tell them, driving another nail home. "It's to remind us what's worth protecting." The children would nod solemnly, though he wasn't sure they understood. His afternoons were devoted to building a long wooden water trough near the church well. He crafted it from sturdy oak planks, sealed tight against leaks, with a gentle slope so even the smallest ponies could drink. Some of the older ranchers muttered about mixing stock, but their complaints faded when they saw how the shared water saved them long rides to distant streams. Not everyone embraced the changes. A few men still gathered outside the shuttered bank, speaking in low voices about proper order and the way things were. But their numbers dwindled as the days passed, and the simple truth became clear. The town was healthier with open wells than closed hearts. One evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of amber and rose, Zeke found Eliza sitting alone on the church steps. She had a slate in her lap, covered with the day's lessons, but her eyes were fixed on the sunset gilding the wooden steeple. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, settling his tall frame beside her when she nodded. They sat in comfortable silence, watching shadow creep across the churchyard. The new water trough caught the last rays of sunlight, its surface gleaming like polished copper. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the sage, its evening song clear and sweet. "You know," Zeke said finally, a hint of teasing in his deep voice. "Seems to me you still owe me something." Eliza turned to him, eyebrows raised. "Oh." As I recalled, there was mention of 7 sons. His eyes crinkled at the corners, and for a moment he looked younger, unburdened by old griefs. A slow smile spread across Eliza's face. "Well now," she said, setting aside her slate, "perhaps we should start with one." She paused, considering. "Maybe a quiet one, like you." Their laughter, soft and genuine, drifted across the churchyard. It was the first real laughter either had shared in days, and it felt like breaking ice on a spring creek, something long frozen finally flowing free. "One would be a fine start," Zeke agreed, his shoulder brushing gently against hers. The setting sun slipped behind the steeple, leaving the cross a dark silhouette against the deepening sky. From the nearby trough came the sound of horses drinking, their peaceful snorts and stamps a counterpoint to the evening's settling quiet. In that moment, watching day fade to dusk, they could feel the first tender shoots of hope taking root, not in grand gestures or bold declarations, but in shared laughter and gentle promises. Like the water flowing freely from the well, like the letters taking shape on student slates, like the healing herbs in Bluebird's careful hands, change came drop by drop, word by word, heart by heart. The first week of August brought change as gentle as morning dew. Bluebird's family settled into a small, whitewashed house at the edge of town, its weathered porch facing east toward the rising sun. Her children helped plant a garden of squash and beans, marking the earth with traditional blessings. The neighbors, watching from their windows, saw how carefully they tended the land. Word arrived by messenger from the tribal council, a formal letter written in both Apache and English. Reverend Cole read it aloud to Zeke and Eliza in the cool shade of the church office. The council recognized them as trusted allies, marking them as friends who had proven their hearts through actions, not just words. Eliza pressed her hand to her chest, touched by the honor. Zeke stood quietly by the window, his weathered face softened with gratitude. The traveling circuit judge arrived on a Tuesday, his black coat dusty from the trail. He set up court in the mercantile's back room, hearing cases between sips of strong coffee. When Eliza stepped forward with Reverend Cole beside her, the room fell silent. She spoke clearly, presenting documents proving her marriage to Trumbull had been built on forged papers. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "I seek to right an old wrong and begin anew." The judge studied the evidence carefully, his spectacles catching the lamplight. With 3 sharp raps of his gavel, he granted the annulment. Eliza's shoulders straightened, as if setting down a heavy burden. Then she presented a carefully drafted land grant, declaring the church well would be held in trust for all residents, settler and tribal alike. "Let water flow free," she said, "like God's grace." The judge signed with a flourish, making it law. Sunday dawned clear and bright. The church bell rang across the valley, calling folks from every direction. They came in wagons and on horseback, on foot and leading burros. Town families in their best clothes, ranch hands with polished boots, tribal members in traditional dress. The little church filled beyond capacity, with children sitting cross-legged in the aisles and young men standing respectfully along the back wall. Reverend Cole stood at the altar, his well-worn Bible open in his hands. Zeke waited there too, tall and solemn in a clean black coat. When Eliza appeared in the doorway, sunlight streaming behind her, a collective breath swept through the gathering. She wore a simple blue dress, her dark hair crowned with a circle of white prairie roses. But it was her smile, bright and unguarded, that transformed her. They joined hands before the altar, speaking ancient vows in voices that carried to the farthest corner. Zeke's deep "I do" resonated with quiet certainty. Eliza's response rang clear as a bell. When Reverend Cole pronounced them husband and wife, the children sprang into action, showering the couple with wild sunflowers gathered from the hills. Then Bluebird stepped forward, raising her voice in a traditional Apache wedding hymn. The melody soared, ancient and beautiful, filling the small church with its blessing. As the final notes faded, she began again in English, and slowly the congregation joined in, their voices weaving together like streams joining into a river. The celebration spilled outdoors as the sun began to set. Tables appeared, laden with food from every kitchen in town: fried chicken and cornbread, wild berry pies and fresh churned butter, Apache fry bread and honey, sweet potato pudding and pickled beans. Lanterns and oil lamps cast warm circles of light as darkness gathered, their glow reflecting off faces filled with joy and hope. Children darted between the tables, playing tag in the deepening shadows. Old men who hadn't spoken in years found themselves sharing stories over coffee cups. Young mothers traded recipes and baby-soothing secrets across cultural lines that seemed to fade like mist in morning sun. Zeke and Eliza moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and well wishes. They paused often to chat, to laugh, to thank each person who had brought food or flowers or simply their presence. When they finally sat down to eat, it was at a long table that held faces of every color and culture in the territory. The night air grew cool, carrying the scent of sage and late summer roses. Lantern light danced across the church's whitewashed walls, casting soft shadows. Around the edges of the gathering, young couples began to dance to fiddle music that floated on the evening breeze. Their movements wove patterns of unity in the dust, like water flowing over dry ground, bringing new life to parched earth. In that moment, watching her neighbors share food and laughter under the stars, Eliza felt the truth of what they had built. Not just a marriage, but a community founded on justice and mutual care. Zeke's hand found hers under the table, strong and steady. Together they had planted seeds of change that would grow for generations to come. The lanterns burned late into the night, their gentle light marking the spot where a town had found its heart again. The weeks flowed like water over smooth stones. Autumn painted the hills in amber and gold as Zeke's hammer rang out daily, building their new cabin on the gentle slope above town. He crafted it with careful thought. Extra-wide doorways, windows that caught the morning light, and most importantly, a table long enough to seat a dozen hungry souls. Eliza brought warmth to the wooden walls. Each evening she gathered children around the stone fireplace, teaching them to sound out words from her old primer. Their small faces glowed in the firelight as letters became stories, and stories became dreams. One crisp October morning, Bluebird arrived carrying a bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. Inside was a boy of about 6 years, with solemn eyes and untrimmed hair. "His name's Jonas," Bluebird said softly, her hand gentle on the child's shoulder. "He needs a pa who listens and a ma who don't scare." She didn't need to explain more. The bruises on his arms told their own story. Zeke knelt down to the boy's level, his voice as gentle as spring rain. "Reckon we got room at our table if you're hungry." Jonas didn't speak, but he stepped forward, closer to Zeke's steady presence. Eliza touched the child's cheek. "Would you like to help me make biscuits?" The boy's slight nod was enough. By supper time, he was kneading dough with flour-covered hands, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. Others followed, drawn by word of the house where children found welcome. 2 weeks later, a boy from the reservation arrived, speaking Apache and English in equal measure. Then came a wild-haired child from the hills, whose ma had gone to glory in the fever season. The sheriff brought a quiet one from the jail orphan roll, his father gone to prison, back east. By the time first snow dusted the valley, 5 boys of different ages and backgrounds shared the long table. With them came Sarah, a girl of 7 whose grandmother could no longer care for her. They learned to pass plates family style, to say please in 3 languages, to help with chores without being asked. The cabin grew loud with laughter and learning. Each child brought their own gifts. Jonas had a way with horses, Sarah could sing like an angel, the hill boy knew every bird call in the territory. They became brothers and sister not through blood, but through shared meals and shared stories. The town watched and slowly changed. Other families began building longer tables, adding extra chairs. The well became a gathering place where children of all backgrounds played together, their voices mixing like music on the wind. What force and greed had failed to achieve, love accomplished day by day, meal by meal, story by story. The summer breeze carried the scent of wild roses as it swept through Sandridge Wells, now a year after justice had restored the town's heart. The church well flowed steady and true, its waters shared freely among all who came. Where once there had been tension and fear, children now played together near its stone walls, their laughter mixing with the splash of drawn water. The church bell rang clear across the valley, calling not for emergency meetings, but for afternoon lessons. Inside, mothers of all backgrounds sat with their little ones, learning letters and numbers together. The old wooden benches, once divided by prejudice, now held neighbors shoulder to shoulder. Near the mercantile, Bluebird organized the town's 3rd medicine drive of the year. Her small shop had become a gathering place where traditional healing met frontier wisdom. Settler women brought willow bark, while Apache mothers contributed sacred herbs, each sharing what they knew for the good of all. At the corral behind their cabin, Zeke leaned against the fence post, his weathered face creased with pride. Jonas, no longer the frightened boy of last year, stood tall as he showed 2 younger brothers the proper way to saddle a horse. His gentle hands guided theirs over the leather straps, his voice steady with newfound confidence. "Pull it snug but not too tight," Jonas instructed, demonstrating the motion. "The horse needs to breathe easy, just like we do." On the wide front porch, Eliza sat in her favorite rocking chair, a well-worn book open in one hand. Against her chest, wrapped in a soft blanket, their newest arrival slept peacefully. The baby boy, born as spring flowers bloomed, had his father's quiet nature and his mother's bright eyes. As evening painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Zeke made his way to the garden, where late summer vegetables grew in neat rows. He knelt in the soft earth beside Eliza's chair, reaching out to touch their youngest son's tiny hand. "Your ma promised me 7 sons." he whispered to the sleeping infant. Looks like she kept her word, though not the way she first meant it. Behind them, lamplight spilled from the church windows, warm and welcoming as a second sunrise. The glow touched their faces, illuminating the peace that had been hard-won through mercy, not violence. Through choosing love over vengeance, they had built something stronger than any fence or wall, a family bound by choice and a community healed by forgiveness. Thanks for being here. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, a truth, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another moment that just might speak to your soul.